So last week we spoke a little bit about intention versus action and how they really should be coming into one package. And with every action, we should have good intention. But if not, then we should still focus on the action because that's what counts. Nonetheless, we did speak about our intention is like the wings of a bird that make it fly, if you recall. And without intention behind our mitzvahs, behind our actions, then the mitzvahs really can't take off. Same with prayer, same with Torah study, same with any type of mitzvah too. That the intention, the kavanah that we have for each and every mitzvah, for each and every action is really what enables that connection between earth and heaven, what makes the action fly. So really they should come ideally as a full package. That was really the big idea. We're still speaking about, the umbrella idea here is about how when we study Torah and fulfill mitzvot, we become one with God. That's really the umbrella idea that I know we've spoken about quite a bit. And that's about it. Well, let's continue at the bottom of page 152, right? Margot?
Correct.
152.
Correct.
For its own sake. Does anyone want to read? Anyone? I guess, Margot, you are...
I'll read.
Okay.
Okay, for its own sake means... Okay, for its own sake means in order to attach one's soul to God through the comprehension of the Torah, each one according to his intellect, as explained in Pir Etz Chaim. The author has just quoted a passage from the Zohar stating that the soul is nourished in Gan Eden by food that derives from Torah Lishma, the study of Torah for its own sake. There are various definitions of what constitutes the study of Torah for its own sake, each expressing the significance of this on a different level. Here, the author presents what, in a certain sense, is the most basic meaning of the term: study for the sake of uniting with God through the comprehension of his wisdom. Such study is, by definition, an altruistic endeavor. Thus, yearning to unite with God is not to be understood as an exercise in self-fulfillment, but as the desire to give pleasure to God, who derives great satisfaction from a soul's reunion with its source, as in the analogy cited in Tanya, chapter 41, of a king's joy when his only child is freed from captivity.
Right. Let's just dwell on this a little bit, because there is this big concept we find in the Talmud and in general in Jewish law that one should study Torah Lishma. Doesn't mean that if you can't study Torah Lishma, and we'll define what that means in a second. It doesn't mean that if you can't study Torah Lishma that you shouldn't study at all. But still, the ideal is to study Torah Lishma. Lishma means for the sake of God himself, or for the sake of that unity between you and God, not for any self-benefit. Many people study the Torah to become wiser. Some people study the Torah because it's going to give them a portion in the world to come, as some people might tell you. Some people study Torah because it's a good GPS for life. It's going to make my life meaningful. But all of these reasons really go back to you. They have nothing to do with God. So basically, you're using God and his wisdom for your own personal sake, for your own, even, dare I say, selfish sake. Mm. And therefore, really, there's no real unity here. There's unity with yourself, with your own selfish needs, but there's no unity with God. Where is God in the picture? You're using God for you. So it's about you. Studying Torah Lishma is to study just in order to unite with God, as Rabbi Stans puts it here, for that basic unity. What are his words? For the sake of uniting with God through the comprehension of his wisdom. You just want to unite with God. It's almost like a relationship, because after all, God and us are compared to a bride and a groom. Right? On Shavuot, that occurred just a few weeks ago, we got married to God. We were the bride and God was the groom. In a relationship, sometimes we have to have moments in which I'm there just for my spouse. And ideally, it should be all the time. I connect just to connect, not for any personal gain. And that's a relationship. That's a two-way relationship. If it's only for me, then it's a one-way relationship. It's not a relationship at all. And the study of Torah really should have that goal, that I'm there to unite with God, not for any selfish purposes, even not to become a rabbi. I don't study Torah so that I can become a rabbi for that diploma. That's a selfish need. I don't study Torah again so that I know how to live a meaningful life. That's a selfish need. I study just to study, just because. It's a high level. I'm not saying it's an easy feat, but it's certainly the goal to study Torah again, lishma. Now, I just want to go deeper into this. I want to hear your thoughts, of course. I don't want this to be a monologue, as sometimes it is. But the word lishma is an interesting word, because lishma means really for her sake, or for her name. Lashem Shelah. And in Hebrew you can put the of in the same word. So lishma, for the sake, for her sake. Who are we talking about? Whose sake? Well, if it's God, God is usually in the Torah at least related as a he. So what's her sake? Why Shema? It should be lishmo in Hebrew. And yeah, we're saying that no, lishma is for the Torah itself. And the Kabbalists explain that when you study Torah, you're not just studying a dead text, not just words. You're studying a text that's very much alive. The Torah has its own personality. The Torah is a she. The word Torah in Hebrew is a female word. So when you come to study the Torah in a way begs you, please, don't use me, don't abuse me. Study it for me, for my sake, for what I want. You know what I want? I'm here to unite you and God. So don't abuse me in a way that you're using me just for yourself. So when we are saying that we ought to study Torah lishma for her sake, we're saying that really we're studying Torah for what she wants, what the Torah itself wants. The Torah wants us to use it in order to unite ourselves with God, and God to unite himself with us. That's who we're referring to. Each time you're studying Torah, we have to, we call the Torah Torat Chaim, that it's a Torah that's alive. The Torah itself speaks to us. More than we speak to it, it speaks to us. And what does it say to us? It says to us a lot of things. But if we had to condense the message of the Torah into one sentence, one idea, is that the Torah begs us, please, use me so that you can further your relationship with God. Don't use me just for you, for your selfish needs. So when we are studying Torah for her sake, lishma, then we are heeding to this call of the Torah, of this Torah that's very much alive. That's why we say lishma. In any case, that's the big idea. Now again, I recognize it's not easy to achieve that, but it's certainly doable. And sometimes we can't do this every time we study Torah, but we should at least have, maybe 5 minutes a day, at least 10 minutes a day in which we study Torah just to say, hello, God, I want to be with you. That's all. Anyhow, that's the big idea of lishma. That's why the Talmud says, Leolam ilmad adam Torah shelo lishma, shemitoch shelo lishma yavo lishma. What this means is that if you think you're not at that level yet, you should still study Torah mitoch shelo lishma, from a state of not lishma, from a selfish state, basically, mitoch, because eventually, hopefully, you'll reach that level of mitoch shelo lishma balishma. From studying Torah from a selfish need, you'll hopefully something will be triggered, and you'll want to study, and you'll attain that level of studying Torah selflessly, just for God. Now, the Hasidic masters would focus on the word mitoch shelo lishma. From within the study, the selfish study, you'll come to a selfless study. From within. What does it mean from within? And the Hasidic masters would say that even when you're studying Torah, lo lishma, not for the sake of uniting with God, but just for your selfish need, within that study, mitoch shelo lishma, ba lishma, you should have a little lishma in it. You should have a little selflessness in it. Even though your primary goal is to study Torah, say just to become wise, still try to dedicate 5 minutes, 10 minutes to a selfless type of study. If you have a little grain of lishma in your lo lishma study, of selfless study, in your selfish study, then eventually, hopefully, you'll reach that level of selfless study, studying just to unite with God. But that's why even when we're studying just for our own sake, we should still try to dedicate some of the time, some of the study to that selfless study that is there just to unite us with God. Anyhow, that's the big idea. I want to hear your comments, please. Anyone? Okay, no one, fine. Anyhow, by the way, I think it's true in relationships if we want to broaden the topic. But in relationships, sometimes we're in it just for ourselves. Okay, so I'm married just so that my wife can make me a good dinner every night. Okay, fine. All right, and I'm married just because my wife can take care of my kids. I'm married just because it's fun. I'm not lonely. It's a way to get out of my loneliness. And there's many selfish reasons of why people say I'm married. But even within those relationships, you should have moments in which you say to yourself, okay, I'm doing this just for my wife. I have no logic, to me at least, to my selfish me. But I'm doing it just because, just to unite. If your relationship has moments like that, then it's still a good relationship. Then it can still grow. But if it's entirely just for me, then there's really no relationship at all. And then that's when relationships really begin to suffer. So it's true, and we can broaden this idea on relationships altogether. You should have moments in which you are there just for your wife. You don't feel like going on a hike with her, but she wants you to, so go and unite with her just for her. You don't feel like buying her this and that, you do it anyway. But anyway, that's true for relationships too. Okay. That's, Rabbi Steinsaltz, speaking of his commentary, so he has a great book called Simple Words. And I think I have it here somewhere, but Simple Words focuses on all sorts of different words, right? Words that he feels have been completely abused, like the word friends, or like the word nature, or like the word God, or like the word sex. Now, one of the chapters is on the word love. And there he speaks of this idea quite a bit, where love is, thank you, Diana, that's the word. That's the book, Simple Words. The subtitle is Thinking About What Really Matters in Life. But in any case, in the chapter Love, which is really what this relationship with God is about, speaks of the analogy of the salmon, of the fish. I don't know if I've shared it, but you can find it in that book, where there was a king who loved this very specific type of fish. So he told his fishermen, go get me this fish. So they went to the sea, and they were saying, the king loves this fish. We have to find this fish. And they started fishing, and finally they found this fish. And they were all happy on the ship, saying, wow, the king loves this fish, and he's going to be so happy. The fish that's still alive, as he's being pulled to the ship, he says to himself, oh, I think I heard that the king loves me. That's great. Thank God. When I get to the palace, he'll save me. He'll throw me back into the sea. I can't wait to meet the king. And throughout the journey back to the palace, they're saying, wow, he loves this fish. He loves this fish. And the fish is becoming happier by the minute. Thank God, someone will save me. Finally, they get to the palace. They put the fish in the kitchen, and the chefs started having an argument. How should we slice the fish, this way or that way? So they say, well, let's ask the king. He loves this fish. So they call the king, and the fish says, gosh, I can't wait to meet him. This is my last chance of being alive. And the king comes into the kitchen, and he says, well, thank you so much. I do love this fish. I want you to slice it this way, not that way. And the fish says to himself, the king doesn't love me. He loves the pleasure that I bring him. So he really loves himself. And very often that's the way we use the word love. That's the way we behave in relationships. We don't love the other. We love the pleasure that the other brings to us. So we love ourselves. Martin Buber famously speaks about the I and it relationship, the I and thou relationship, and the I and I relationship. Very many relationships are the I and it, which means I refer to the other as an object. He's an it, or she's an it. As long as I have need for, I need this object, then I'll use it. Second, I don't need this object anymore, I'll throw it away, because after all, it's like a lifeless object to me. That's the I and it relationship. There's an I and thou relationship where I relate to the other as a subject. Na is a thou, na is an entity. And I need to create somewhat of a relationship. And that maybe has some selfish elements to it, but also has some selfless elements to it. The ultimate relationship is the I and I, where I'm so one with the other that it's never about me anymore. It's almost like I've you know, they say that, I mean, it's not a good example, but people start looking like their pets, right? You ever heard of that before? Or pets, because you're so one with your pet that maybe he's taken upon yourself some of your characteristics. It's a terrible example because I don't think you can reach that level with the pet, but still, there's an I and I relationship where I'm so one with the other that he's me and I'm him, not for any selfish reasons, but there's that oneness. That's not about me. It's never about my ego anymore. My ego is completely lost in this oneness. And that's the ultimate relationship. But it's true with God too, not just with human beings. Many people relate to God, unfortunately, as an it. So I'll use God as long as he can get me high, like a drug. So you're not uniting with God, you're uniting with yourself. I'll use God to make my life better. That's nice. But again, there's no relationship there. You're using it for yourself. When you use God in a way just for God, because you recognize that it's about this relationship and it's about almost, as the Christians call it, losing yourself in God. I hate that expression because I think you find yourself in God. You don't lose yourself in God. But losing your ego in God, I would suggest that addition. Losing your ego in God, then really you have then a relationship. Then you transcend yourself, and that's true unity. That's a true relationship. That's not easy again, but fortunately, people use God as an it. Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the author of the Tanya, right here, was once found in a state of complete ecstasy. And he said, he was shouting, and he was saying, God, I don't want your rewards. I don't want your world to come, any portion in Gan Eden, in paradise. I just want you alone. That's all I want. That's the ultimate relationship. I don't want anything in return. I want you alone. Maybe to go deeper a little bit into this, and I'm the only one speaking here, so I feel like terrible, but just one more thought from the Torah. But it's interesting to note that Jacob fell in love with Rachel, right? In that biblical story. Now, he's cheated by his father-in-law. Eventually, when time comes to marry Rachel, Rachel is exchanged with Leah. We all know the story, and he is forced to marry Leah. Now, I mean, he married Leah and then realizes, God, that's not the woman I wanted to marry. So his father-in-law comes and says, no, in our place, the older daughter needs to get married first. That's why you had to marry her. That was his excuse. You have to work another 7 years for Rachel if you still want to marry her. Jacob is so in love with Rachel that he says, fine, I'll work another 7 years. Now, the Torah then states, which means that to Jacob, those 7 years seemed like just a few days because he loved her so much. Does it make sense to you? Mm-hmm. Usually when I'm waiting for something important to happen, every day seems like 7 years. Mm. Here it's the opposite. 7 years seemed like a few days. Mm. Why is that? Should say those 7 years seemed like an eternity, like 50 years.
That's Einstein's theory of relativity.
There you go. It could very well be. Time is an illusion, as he would put it. But the Kabbalist explains something very powerful and speaking to the essence of unity. And that is, why does it seem like eternity when we wait for let's say, to meet someone that we love? That's because I'm waiting for something in return. I'm waiting for that hug. And as long as I don't have that hug, say, then every moment seems like eternity. But if I'm not waiting for anything in return, if I love just to love, then really there is then time doesn't swell itself up. Then 7 years seem like just a few days, because the intensity of the bond is always there and it doesn't expect anything in return. That intensity is all that counts to you. I mean, another terrible example, it's like watching Camelback Mountain right here in Arizona. It's beautiful. And I'm not waiting for a hug in return. That intensity is always there. So whether it's 7 years until I get to see Camelback or not, I know that the intensity is there. And that's why 7 years, Jacob had that ultimate level of love. And that's why 7 years really seemed like just a few days, which is against logic. But again, because he wasn't waiting for anything in return. That was pure love. And in a way, that's the ultimate game. Back to this idea. It's the ultimate relationship where I love just because, just to unite. It's not about me. It's about the thou. Or ultimately, it's about the I and the other. Eye to eye.
I just want to comment on, you said before, people use God. I don't think anyone could use God. I think they misuse the idea of what God is, not misusing or using God.
Right. Right. I mean, they don't use, right. I see where you're going. You're right. Yeah, I think it was Nietzsche who said that we don't love others. We love the version of ourselves in others. So, and that goes back to the same point. And if you love, by the way, the version of yourself in others, then you're loving yourself. You don't love others. Same here. The God that we're speaking about when people use or abuse God is the version of themselves in God that they love. So it's not really about God, it's about themselves. Yeah.
So I'm sitting here thinking about the self is kind of like an octopus that no matter which way you turn and try to find that sort of pure intent, it grabs you and it morphs itself into all kinds of disguises and, you know, and then how to navigate it so that you, well, sometimes there's just a moment of grace where you transcend its hold and there you are. But sometimes it also takes just keeping a watchful eye. And if we judge that self, the reducing sort of self-interested self, it makes it actually harder to transcend it, because if we judge ourselves, we can't see ourselves as we are. So if we suspend judgment and just say, not say where is my ego or my self-interest, but not do I have ego or self-interest, but where is it right now? So then we're in a pragmatic, like non-judgmental self-observation, and then we can see it as it is and, like, you know, park it or navigate around it consciously and intentionally.
Right.
But again, even then, the octopus is there. The octopus is there. And it just takes something, sometimes just a miracle or a tragedy or something that like breaks us out of it. And maybe regular practice, regular study, as you say, also, right. Just right. To like, it just all of a sudden suspends itself and there we are.
Right. Right. Well said. I like the octopus analogy. It's true. On the other hand, again, the Talmud goes back to saying that even if you feel like that octopus has gotten hold of you, doesn't mean you should stop yourself from studying Torah. Still, engage in that study. I would add that I think that sometimes the best way to deal with ego is not to deal with it at all. Sometimes the best way to deal with negative emotions is not to deal with them at all. Because sometimes we're just not equipped to deal with them. So you come from a weak standpoint, just like any type of conflict. If I'm going to lose. So maybe best is not to deal with it at all. Let me engage in action, what I need to do, whether the intention is there or not, and hopefully that action will trigger some selflessness in me. Yeah. But it is indeed, it's not, I mean, I think it's a life task. It's not, doesn't happen overnight. Yeah. But I think,
Rabbi,
yes, please, William.
Okay, I was just mentioning before about using God. The other point is that there are sometimes people who speak for God. And I don't think anyone has the right or the knowledge to speak for God. I'll just give you an example. Here's a book, Shema Yisrael.
Yeah.
It's basically Holocaust stories, and it's written by the Caliver Rebbe.
Yeah.
And he writes in his introduction one sentence which I feel very, very uncomfortable when I read this. And he writes clearly, talking about the Holocaust, it was a divine decree. I don't think anyone has the right to make any statements of that nature.
Well, he was a Holocaust survivor himself.
Yes, nevertheless.
Beard because the Nazis pulled his beard out in the most cruel way, tortured him. So I think if Holocaust survivors can speak about the Holocaust, so I would give him that credit. He can.
But I'm saying not to speak on behalf of God. That's what I'm saying.
Right. Oh, fine. I understand. Yeah. 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 By the way, he's buried not far from Rabbi Steinsaltz. So I was just at his grave too. There's quite a few Hasidic Rebbes there. They are Holocaust survivors. The Kalev Rebbe, the Bolshevik Rebbe also. It's not far from Rabbi Steinsaltz. Anyway, yeah. We're holy souls. Okay. Fine, we can continue a little bit, unless again, please speak your mind. Where's Ronnie when we need him? Okay. Anyone else? All right, let's continue then on page 153 here, the food of the soul. Does anyone want to continue?
Come on, somebody else.
Nobody else?
Nobody wants to listen to me all the time.
No. Whoever, really.
All right. The food of the soul is in the nature of inner light. Inner light, or panimi, is the Kabbalistic term for those divine influences that a person or other entity imbibes and internalizes, something he can absorb and integrate into his being. Food is thus the analogy for inner light. The reference to Torah understanding as food for the soul expresses the concept that Torah study is an emanation of inner light from God.
Right. Right. So, and then the other side is Makif. So, let's continue. I think this is what this is about to say. Go ahead.
While the garments are in the nature of encompassing light, garments are the analogy for what Kabbalah terms encompassing light, or Makif, also Makifim, encompassers. These are divine influences that are external to the person, not only in the sense that they exist outside of him, but also in terms of the manner in which they affect him. These are not internalized and consciously assimilated. Their influence on the person is not direct and palpable. A soul's garments, as we said, facilitate the relationship between it and its environment, which affect the soul without being consciously recognized by it and assimilated into itself.
Right. So every human being is really two facets. By the way, that's why the word face in Hebrew is in the plural tense. I know we've spoken about this because panim, right? Because we have the inner face and we have the outer face. Now, the inner being is nurtured by the Torah that is internalized. When you study Torah, you have to internalize it. You can't just read the words of the Torah without internalizing them. You can't. Your brain absorbs something. So the Torah is really what nurtures the inner being. And therefore, that connection is called Or Pnimi, or internal light. Now, the mitzvot, which are accomplished not just for ourselves, but mainly for the world around us, they are called Or Makif, the encompassing light, or the light that's external. Why? Because it creates external light. Now, in a way, the Torah and mitzvot have to come together because they really are the ones that provide light for both facets of the person, the inner facet and the outer facet. The Torah, again, for the inner one, and the mitzvot for the outer one. You can't just have Torah, inner light, without having that outer light. If you don't have outer light, then your inner light really is not worth much. If it can't really trigger you to do something, to illuminate light, the essence of light, the default setting of light is to illuminate. If you don't allow the Torah in you to illuminate on the outside, then really you probably don't even have Torah. Or like the Talmud says, Kol haomer ein li ela Torah, afilu Torah ein lo. That whoever says, I only have Torah, even Torah he doesn't have. Because the whole essence of light is to illuminate. So when we absorb that inner light, it then must trigger this mitzvah or the mitzvot that we do to use that light from the inside towards the outside and to start illuminating. Same is true the other way around. If one says I only have external light, that external light that doesn't have an anchor, that doesn't have, it's like a candle that doesn't have wax or doesn't have a wick. That's not light, it's fake light, but it's not real light. So you need both facets. The Torah that nurtures your inner light and the mitzvot that then use that inner light to illuminate towards the outside. Otherwise, really, there's no candle altogether. There's no real light altogether.